The Bible as a Handbook for Understanding Self. Part 2. By Shane Miller. Genesis Analyzed. To return now to the book of Genesis in a more thorough examination of the books of the Bible, we find a situation which is as full of mystery and symbology as the book of Revelation. Indeed, Edgar Cayce suggests that the books of Genesis and Revelation be studied together, asserting that without an understanding of one, it is next to impossible to understand the other. We refer to the material contained in the first 3 chapters of Genesis, that part having to do with the coming of man. Here is an enigma that has baffled the scholars and theologians for ages. Yet the remainder of the story of man as found in the Bible is played against the backdrop of this material. Without an understanding of these first 3 chapters, the story following them has a way of coming apart at the seams. It flies into fragments and contradictions, bringing despair to many an earnest student. The story of creation and the coming of man is set forth in the book of Genesis almost as a fable or fairy tale. The heavens and earth are brought into being with a word, the animals make their appearance. All is in order. Then comes man. God says, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness. And let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth." The 27th verse of the first chapter of Genesis then goes on to tell that this was done, adding that, "Male and female created he them." However, in the 7th verse of the 2nd chapter of Genesis we find a repeat performance. Or do we? The verse reads, "And the Lord God formed man of the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life. And man became a living soul." We are now told of the creation of the garden, eastward in Eden, in which were planted the fruit trees, the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, that truly fateful one. Next we read of a river that went out of Eden to water the garden, thence parting and becoming 4 heads. Man was placed in the garden and given his instructions. "Of every tree of the garden thou mayest freely eat, but of the tree of knowledge of good and evil thou shalt not eat of it, for in the day that thou eatest thereof thou shalt surely die." So the stage is set. Here the action will take place. Here will come the experience of the temptation, from here the fall. But the cast of characters is not yet complete. Eve, the woman, is lacking. Eve, we are told, is created out of one of Adam's ribs, taken from his body during sleep. Then the serpent, most subtle of the beasts of the field, is able to persuade Eve, and through her Adam, to partake of the fruit of the forbidden tree. Briefly, this is a recapitulation of the fall of man, as it has been called, for after this act Adam and Eve are both driven out of the Garden of Eden. Moreover, cherubim and a flaming sword are set to keep them from returning, and from that day on, man will be forced to eat his bread in the sweat of his face. Now all these things, as we look at them, make up either a very fine fairy tale or else are a full set of symbols which cover what actually happened. However, if we make a quick review of the scientific story of the coming of man, we may catch a glimpse of how the biblical story and the scientific line of thought seem to converge in a very odd, strange way. The theory of evolution. The scientific hypothesis might be summed up as follows: man began in the sea as a single cell. He separated from himself, evolved into a fish creature, and then climbed up on the land. Man is portrayed as one of the animals, and presumably developed with all the rest of them. However, it has never been made quite clear how or why he rose above being merely an animal and began producing inventions, government, science, religion, poetry, etc. When Mr. Darwin wrote The Origin of the Species in 1859, he presented a hypothesis of the idea of evolution. Darwin's concept was that man and the anthropoid apes had a common origin. From this point, man evolved upward, to become more than he had been. Why the rest of the animals failed to evolve also was never disclosed. Later, when Freud came along to develop a theory of the nature of the mind of man, he seems to have accepted Darwin's premise completely, and reasoned that as man was an evolved animal, there must have been a stage in his development when he acted on the level of the savage, lustful, selfish mind that we associate with the beasts. Freud designated this mind as the id. Still later, when man began to reason and think, a kind of second mind formed over the first. This second mind Freud called the ego. The ego was thought to have pressed down the id to a point below the consciousness, where it no longer ruled, and man, operating through the ego level, could carry on the creation of his civilization. However, under the stress of hunger, fear, and lust, Freud felt that there were moments in man's history when the old id mind took over, and then came the holocausts. As if the warfare between the id and the ego were not enough, Freud developed the theory that over and above the ego a third mind had developed, which he called the superego. This was the one in which reposed the social conscience, concepts in time and space, ideas of morality, and so on. According to the scientific hypotheses, therefore, man began in a lowly state and evolved to be whatever he is today, with one layer of mind developing and forming over the other in turn. Symbology of the Garden of Eden. Returning to Genesis, let us now look into the symbology in which that story appears to be clothed. According to Genesis and the Edgar Cayce material on it, God, or the first cause, created man in his own image. This implies the pattern only, not the whole man at this point. In John's Gospel the term is the Word. In the beginning was the Word. If we can accept this as meaning the soul as the vehicle to be for human experience, the second mention of the creation of man in Genesis can be more clearly understood. The dust of the ground, from which he was formed, according to the 7th verse of the 2nd chapter of that book, implies something of the earth earthy, that is, a physical body. Since the word dust could mean the smallest particle of matter known to a pastoral people, we might have a better understanding of the creation by thinking of these smallest particles of matter as electrons forming around the nuclei held in the image or pattern. This would demonstrate three things: that the soul was created first, that man was created, not evolved, at least physically, and that he was created for a purpose. He did not evolve in a hit-or-miss manner. To explain the symbology of the Garden of Eden, we might proceed in this way: Eden, east, first, or in the beginning. The garden where everything grew was the first mind in a universal sense. Ideas and principles could grow in such a garden. Let us then set down this account of man's beginning in direct terms and put aside the symbology of antiquity. As man was first imaged in the mind of his Creator, he started out on a level with God. They shared the first estate, or Eden. Since God created man for companionship, according to Edgar Cayce, the desire for this was already within Adam as a part of God. As man was made after God's desire, so woman appeared in answer to man's desire. The entire procedure was inevitable. Together, man and woman, acting as independent creators without knowledge or responsibility, became a dangerous potential and jeopardized the balance of universal forces. Behold, the Lord said, in verse 22 of the 3rd chapter, "The man is become as one of us, to know good and evil. And now, lest he put forth his hand, and take also of the tree of life, and eat, and live forever. So the Edenic or first mind was sealed off, and over it formed the conscious, reasoning mind which man uses today. The new mind was one primarily of limitation when compared with the unlimited powers of the Edenic mind. Time and space factors had to be reckoned with. Motion was another consideration. Nothing could be called into being with a word now. One had to do things in sequence, which brought in further considerations of cause and effect. Man's thoughts became fragmentary. He had to put a number of components together in order to have a whole concept. Even then, he could never be sure he had all the facts. This was the fall of man, an almost perpendicular drop in consciousness. He could now see his environment only, as through a glass darkly. Errors compounded and were followed by suffering and sorrow. It was in dreams alone that he could return to the Edenic existence. In comparing the Freudian concepts with the biblical story, we find one main difference. Science conceives of man as starting on a low level and struggling to comparative heights of creativity. Genesis shows us man starting out on a divine height and plummeting to the level of the beasts, at which point evolution really begins. The two stories do not contradict each other, necessarily. Rather, they adopt different viewpoints, the one concerned with the physical vehicle, the other with the first cause or intent. Thus, in the Bible we find a tapestry of tragedy. The first 3 chapters give the cause of man's fallen estate. The remainder tell of his struggles to return to Eden, or the first consciousness of blissful companionship with the Creator. There are innumerable case histories, trial and error, suffering and triumph in the Bible. Almost every personal experience possible to man is recounted. Any reader can find his own story there. At the very end of it all is the Book of Revelation, by means of which a determined seeker after truth can set himself on the homeward path again, provided he is really ready for the sacrifices required.